Okay, this is the fortress, pastiche of a fortress. It was built to become a symbol of the Portuguese long-time occupation. I'll talk about it in a while. But what I was trying to make the point across is the need to go back to imperial archives and to see other projections of the representation of the continent. And this is a map of the Congo and the pays de Kafir. Kafir, it's a very interesting, as most of you probably know a little bit about the Muslim world. It was a way of addressing the non-believers. So it became the name used to define the West Africa through the eyes of the Muslims, and it entered into the Portuguese narratives and later on into the French and the British. But what we see is that appropriation of this narrative in the 19th century by the British, especially by the British in that region, and became a symbol or synonymous of the barbarians, the tribal people that needs to be tamed by the colonial presence. But what is interesting, that was my goal, was to show you the complexity of the political landscape that we have in Southern Africa, in south of Sahara region, and suddenly by mid-19th century, we start being presented with this map of exploration of the continent that will be the map made with the names of the explorers, which were sent by Italy, by France, by Portugal, by the UK, in order to discover the continent. And that is going to be what is now called the literary map of Africa, is going to be the interpretation of the African continent through Western eyes. But that became, in a sense, the dominant narrative that's still pretty much present in the libraries that we use nowadays and in the archives. And it requires a sort of rereading against the grain of the information that these libraries entail. But one of the important things that these maps show us is that it was not just the physical appropriation of the space, it was also the appropriation of the territory, claiming that the Africans had no history, so the history could be made upon the arrival of the Europeans. And one of the interesting elements that we got was the question of renaming the land and renaming it with the names imported from Europe. So it's emerging a lot of New England, New Lisbon, New Viseu, and lots of lands named upon the British, like Livingston, like other names, the Gold Coast, Cameroon, still today. And these are countries like Rhodesia, Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, based upon a very problematic figure that was Cecil Rhodes. But those was the colonial construction of Africa and the occupation of Africa that we saw. And this consolidation, the consolidation of this occupation was really made up, especially confirmed in Berlin Conference not so long ago. Actually, the conference ended the day Russia attacked Ukraine, and somehow we forgot about that also important day when the Berlin Conference finally, that was a meeting of 14 imperial powers upon the fate of the African continent, with this idea that the European powers could really occupy the region, erasing histories and imposing other narratives. And this is an installation by Yonka Shonibar that represents 14 life-size mannequins dressed in African fabrics, but they had less. And they were sitting at the table scrambling the continent. So that is that violent exercise that in a sense, in theory, legitimized the European presence in the continent and led to a violent series of episodes. Here, so what is in a name? The Mozambique, which is basically a territory result most of the borders of Africa were defined at Berlin Conference, with no participation of Africans in most of these decisions, resulted also in renaming the region. So what is in the name? Lourenço Marques became the 1965. Lourenço was a set of very small huts. It was that famous fortress. Now you have an image of it in this picture that is kept in the archives in Mozambique. But Portugal, because of the Berlin Conference, had to prove that it had the control of that region. So for economic and political reasons, led a series of very violent military campaigns of occupation of that region. So it brings again the question of how can we ask about reparations, about this military campaign that not only stole goods, but also stole lots of lives that were the result of those interventions. So this military campaign that we witnessed, and this is the campaign, the military that took part in that campaign. So the list of names is known. They were headed by Mozinho de Albuquerque, a very famous person. I think most of the Portuguese cities have either a street or an avenue or a square named after Mozinho de Albuquerque. I think one of the biggest squares, also known as Rotunda da Boa Vista in Oporto city, is named Mozinho de Albuquerque. And quite often the description that you have below the name is like one of the conquest of Mozambique. So that is the Portuguese description about Mozinho de Albuquerque, which is the point I was trying to make initially, that we need to think carefully about the history seen from two different sides, because as we say in Mozambique, there are always two sides to a story. Usually it's the story of the hunter that gets to be told, but we also need to know the side of the lion that was also part of that process. So what we see is that the military invasion that was led by Mozinho de Albuquerque since in 1895 on the territory of the Gaza state, which integrated most of the southern part of Mozambique. So it was a state that existed with all the problems associated with it. But this military campaign against the state, with whom Portugal would exchange letters and diplomatic material, was a violent genocidal act. And the Portuguese hero of Gaza, Mozinho de Albuquerque, not only conquered the state, but also led as a means to destruct the resistant capacity of the Gaza state, killed a whole series of military headmen in the capital, in Chaimite and in Mandlacas. But what I think it's interesting regarding this case is that most of these narratives, as in the case of the Benin state, are kept in Portuguese archives. So archives became a sort of silent forensic proof of these violent events, because we have a reference to the looting, to the burning, to the killing of the enemies. And in a sense, it was never an attempt to erase these violent acts, because at the time that was the narrative that would make sense to really symbolize the conquest of the state. What I think it's important here is to see that the capital of the Gaza state was killed. So you'll see in that description, there's a narrative from the 1930s describing where the capital was located and this destruction, but also objects that were part of Gungunhana house were stolen or removed or looted. You choose the name by the Portuguese army that led the attack against Gaza state. So you have here a cup, a silver cup offered by Queen Victoria to Gungunhana, which was seized by Mozinho de Albuquerque. And what is interesting is that most of the objects, like a rifle and this cup, they had no scientific or ethnographic value, but they were seized as war trophies, and also to prove that the Portuguese had conquered, and now there was a terra nullius, terra empty of power, to be now conquered, that conquest by the Portuguese to be now filled with other people, with other projects, because suddenly these people, this Gaza state with whom Portugal would exchange diplomatic representatives, suddenly became the barbaric, the tribal people that usually were under the need to be educated and civilized by the Portuguese. And that is the problem of the academic work when we're discussing what colonialism was about, is that we quite often forget about all these episodes, and especially we tend not to understand how much of the imperial history is still kept in the narratives, for instance, the naming of streets in Portugal and the associated narratives with the people that led all these military involvements. So my claim is that we need to revisit archives, museums, monuments, to rethink alternative interpretation, to read against the grain as a way to address these grievances and to come to solutions that will be obviously non-violent, but to explain how history has shaped our faith. But also I think it's important to think how much countries which were colonies designed sport labor force from Portugal, which was in excess without capacity to hold the population. How can we describe these settlers colonies as a way to recreate the little Europes? And now I'm using Eduard Said's reference, because it's really important to start understanding Lourenço Marques, which later on became Maputo, as a city, as in this image. It's an image from 1925 that presents Lourenço Marques as a modern African city that aims not to be felt like Africa. So settlers' colony was a way of creating the conditions in Africa for the settlers to arrive, mimicking what was present in the metropolitan spaces. So the question here was not just the renaming of the space. So we'll see this street downtown Maputo, and now it's called Olof Palme, was then Consigliere Pedroso. But this occupation of the territory that became known at that time, at the end of 19th century, as Mozambique, was also the emergences of another historical narrative glorifying the colonizing mission of Portugal, the civilizing mission, and the occupation of this territory. And the question is that when we are talking about creating alternative narratives, colonial narratives, we also have to start thinking how this occupation was really closely followed by the occupation of these territories by names, by toponymy, and especially by monuments, glorifying happenings and heroes that were mostly imported from Portugal. This was not the case of Mozambique. I'm talking mostly about Mozambique, but if, for instance, you visit Angola, you will see a similar situation in the fort of Luanda, where you have, for instance, the figure of the first king of Portugal, which had nothing absolutely to do with colonial expansion, but still there was a monument to him. So it was really that idea of reproducing Portugal in Africa. And that is a condition that makes it quite difficult sometimes to understand the renamings and reframings of this colonial context. And associated with it, as I think it was this, we have to understand imperialism, not just with military campaign, but also with these practices of occupying foreign territories, reconstructing abroad the hospitals, the chemists, the court system, the educational system, the state, because the state is a bequest of Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique when we are using laws, when we are using knowledges that say very little to the people that live in those regions. But at the same time, what was sought here, it's very interesting. It's that we need to see quite often, to go back to these monuments, to these images that are still kept in the National Archives in Mozambique. The image, suddenly the image of decolonizer, because one of the interesting elements, as I showed in a couple of slides before, was the idea that the Portuguese were kept in a small fortress, downtown Lourenço Marques, in a very small region, whereas there was the remaining territory, which were much more healthy because it was upper in the upper areas where the African people would live. What happens is that with the conquest, the Africans were sent back to unhealthy regions, usually the lagoons and regions that would surround Lourenço Marques. And then we'll see the territorial segregation, with the healthy part where the white people would live, and the cement city would be the city where the settlers would live, would be surrounded by a black the Reeds city, which will be the region where the mass of black workers that would feed into the city and would working for the Portuguese. So that was the way the city was built. But in order to prove that the quality of the conquest, we will see Lourenço Marques as a colonial city, as I said, importing a whole set of monuments, claiming the presence of the Portuguese in the region, the construction of infrastructures, as I mentioned, built for the use of the Portuguese, so the courts, the schools, and so on, were essentially for the white. But at the same time, what we see also is that what is very interesting is this idea how the Africans will be portrayed in these monuments. And this monument to Mozinho de Albuquerque, which was beginning to think about it in the 1920s, but was officially only implemented in the 1940s, was a mean to address the Portuguese authority over the territory. So Mozinho de Albuquerque symbolized, as described at those times when the monument was unveiled, as bringing the civilizing mission to the continent. And this was the implantation of this monument in one of the main squares of the city was a symbol to address the violent transformation of the Gaza state into the colony of Mozambique. And in a sense, it echoes the words of Mozinho de Albuquerque that very early on would state that for the Negroes, as for all primitive people, authority is only one, derived from the same force. So that was the political project. But here you see the square and the presence of the statue that was surrounded by Portuguese stones that would read the names of all the violent military campaigns where Mozinho de Albuquerque participated, quite often leading them. And in a sense, they perpetuate the memory of subordination of the various groups. At the same time, was a symbol of the appropriation campaigns of the Gaza state, of Colella also in the region, of Taimite, of Maputo, and against Mozambique. And the square, which was in the statue, it was mimic of the image of one of the photographs that we have really of the military in Gaza. It was equestrian statue of Mozinho de Albuquerque, but below we have here, you'll see some of in this region, there will be these panels, bronze, that would replicate the domination of Ngunyan. And we have on the right, the subordination of Ngunyan. It's recorded in the archives, the sentence saying, now you are nothing. From a king, you become a very little man, a regular with no power. So those were the words of Mozinho de Albuquerque when he finally took over Ngunyan, the ruler of Gaza state. But this so in a sense, this square, main square, that would can most of the services and commercial activities will take place with upper, more healthy residential areas of Lourenço Marques, is indeed a symbol of colonialism, and it embodies the violence present in the building of the city. So this image seen from the town hall that is right behind us. But in 1961, following India's annexation of Goa, in the pavement, it was written in Portuguese, "Here is Portugal." So it was the message inscribed again at the core of the city that was a territory conquered by the Portuguese, and that affirmation would be present there. So this ensemble that will be this monument and what written, it was a moment of power, and also combining the self-legitimation revision of the past by the Portuguese and the fixing of this mythical idea of the Portugal as an empire, and at the same time as Portugal, as in Portuguese they would say, from Minho to Timor, of Portugal as an indivisible empire beyond time. And this raises a question. Once in 1974, there was a coup d'etat in Lisbon, which was triggered by the uprising military actions. The result of military in Portugal that understood the impossibility of continuing with a war that would lead to no result, because there were three regions struggling against the colonial fascism regime of Portugal in Africa, and the struggles were going in Angola, in Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. So there were 5 movements fighting against Portugal. And finally, the military in Portugal decided themselves to seize the power to end the war. Basically, and I understand, they wanted to leave because they were young, they wanted to have their families, and they understood that there was no result for the war. So the question was, there were about 300 white people living in Mozambique, mostly in 3 cities, in Lourenço Marques, Beira, and Tete. So what to do with white people whose narrative about this territory was obviously not a narrative shared by the main liberation movement, which was Frelimo. So the city during this period of transition saw a very interesting process that very people know about. It was the removal of the statues during the transition period. So it was a time when Mozambique was ruled by a Portuguese High Commissioner. There was a transition government made up of Portuguese and of Mozambicans. And the statues and lots of toponymic names of streets and squares were renamed. And you see the 2 images. People would say that the removal was done at night. Most of the removal statues were carried out during the day. I saw a couple of them when I was young in school, but it calls the attention to this tension regarding requiring for another narrative about that place and to decolonize landscape. And this is a very interesting element that we have in Mozambique, because otherwise we'll never been able to open up the story if the colonial present will continue. So this cultural movement of reclaiming other narratives, the possibility of acquiring new names, the old new names to places, localities, streets and squares, a strong moment. And decolonization became a concept that was widely discussed, meaning the possibility of having another historical narrative, integrating dreams, challenges, and posing other problems in a context where most people knew absolutely nothing regarding African history. So through names, renaming streets, renaming locations, we suddenly had to face the presence of other historical narratives, of other people, of other heroes, besides the Portuguese heroes and Portuguese narratives that were the narratives about Mozambique. So in a sense, this removal of this monument symbolized, in my view, the return of Les Damnés de la Terre, to use the Frantz Fanon expression, the former colonized subjects finally taking over again the city after almost 70 years removed from those places. But it also signaled a profound epistemic change in preparation, the constitution of the African identity of Mozambique beyond this violence of exploration and humiliation. But at the same time, the past could not be forgotten, and the decision of taking down these colonial monuments clearly said that they should be preserved in Mozambique, in museums and in other locations, so that they can be elements for the study of the historical past. So there was this need to preserve the monuments. A couple of them were melted down because of the antagonism they suscitated. I think it was the case of the monument of the then Archbishop of Lawrence Marques, but most of them are still kept in the city, and we know about them. The question, however, is about where to maintain these monuments. And the question is that in most of these monuments, and now finally you can see the statue of Mozinho de Albuquerque, they were kept in this fortress downtown Mozambique. So it was a Portuguese fort where the Portuguese monuments are kept. But there is a catch. In the late 1980s, Mozambican government asked the Portuguese government for the return of the remains of Ngunhana, the head of the Gaza state that had lost the war and been deported to Azores in Portugal, where he died. After very complex historical research and archaeological excavations, from what I am aware of, basically nothing was left of Ngunhana. So basically what Mozambique got back were the sand where he had been buried. But, and with lots of bureaucratic problems, in 1995, Ngunhana remains symbolically arrived back in Maputo and now rests in a very nice wooden urn kept surprise in Maputo fortress. So sometimes we say that until death ties apart. I think in this case, Ngunhana and Mozinho de Albuquerque keep being together, which is rather complicated because this idea of Mozambicanness is identity construction. It's interesting, but at the same time is not being carefully addressed, in my view, by political powers in Mozambique. So Ngunhana lies in the fortress together with colonial heroes, and especially with Mozinho de Albuquerque, his arch-enemy. And at the same time, by occupying this public space with these two monuments, is a kind of misleading the information we are sending to the younger generation. I chose not to show the picture, but quite often, because the monument of Mozinho de Albuquerque is quite nice, the young couples that get married, they like very much to take a picture with Mozinho de Albuquerque's horse, riding the horse in the back. So it's an absence of a colonial memory that is very problematic. And whereas some people say that we needed to make peace with, and Ngunhana was also got support, the Portuguese struggle against Ngunhana from some African leadership because of violence of Ngunhana's rulers. At the same time, I think that we need to be more careful regarding the past, as this Ngunhana and Mozinho de Albuquerque raises many questions, because this is attempt to put two different worlds, a colonized and the colonizer, is still in conflict. The history books tell a story that is not the story that we see in this monument, and it calls for attention of calls our attention to the necessity of exploration of what meant the destruction. Just to give you an example, the photograph have about the destruction of the capital, Mantilhacas and Chaimite, are very seldom known, as very seldom shown in Mozambique, and very people know indeed about the destruction. The capital was burned down by the Portuguese. So it calls our attention to be more careful about dealing with the past and occupying again the public space with contradictory images about our past. But not all the narratives are like that. The northern part of Mozambique is really part of the circuits of the Indian Ocean, and Camões, who is known as a Portuguese hero, was also taken down. It was a monument from the 1960s present in the island, but some 20 years ago, the top statues of the island started the journey back. There were 3 or 4 more. And the question of Camões is really interesting because at the time that the statue was put back, there were 2 very interesting moments associated with it. There was a very strange drought in Mozambican island. There is a Portuguese fort in Mozambican island with a big cistern, and the cistern was almost empty. When Camões was put back in the pedestal, the rains got back. So there was this idea that Camões was the guy facing the ocean, controlling the winds, the monsoon winds that were supposed to bring the rain. So that was the claim that led the Mozambican government to put Camões back, was to bring back the rain. So that was the first moment which I found rather interesting, the symbolic meaning that facing the ocean controls the rain. But the second is also a moment that calls about the importance of seeing this public narrative, these memoirs, as a form of thinking co-production, the co-appropriation of memories. In one of my last visits to the island in 2003 or 2004, a young student of the island wanted to show me the island. I had been there many times, but at the end I said, okay, fine, tell me. And he went to show me Camões, and the story, and I'm going to be very brief about the story, was really interesting because he kept telling me, you know, the Mozambican government, the guys from the south, so between the south and the north, the guys from the south wanted to remove Camões because Camões is our hero. He was writing the history of Mozambique. He was writing about us, but the Portuguese didn't want him to write our story. So they beat the hell out of him. He lost one eye and he had to the island across to survive. But he finally got back and we really made a monument to him. He is our hero, he's writing our story. That's where Mozambique started, is with Camões. I was really puzzled with this story because I never heard about it. Suddenly, Camões, his hero, was a Mozambican hero. But at the same time, it shows us how complex memory are, how complex these historical processes are, and quite often how official history is a narrative. It's a narrative of power to consolidate a nation-state project, as I heard from my previous colleagues. But in a sense, I think we need to understand the complexity of the processes of reappropriation with these memories that are part of the struggles for identities and for recognition in our countries, which are very complicated countries. So the struggle for self-determination has to be seen also as a reappropriation of a memory that has been sanctioned by colonialism, but also as other moments of appropriation that goes beyond the control of colonial perspective. So I think this narrative of the youngster, who was probably mid-school, suggests that Mozambique has a very rich, dense, and complex history that cannot just be subsumed to that dominant idea of the barbaric past of traditional authorities of ethnic groups, which is the dominant historical narrative African history, the complexity of the African past, but at the same time, it illustrates the transient nature of post-colonial urban symbolic spaces. So the question is, in this very turbulent times, can we use public space to create narratives where we get together, we learn from each other, beyond imposed narratives, recognizing similarities, mutualities, interconnections, instead of affirming a single narrative, which is usually at the core of the nation state and which is a violent project? And I will leave you to here because I think most people are leaving and I wanted to have some discussion. And thank you very much.